Hi, this is Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Interarbor Solutions, and you're listening to BriefingsDirect. Way back in 1996, when web browsing was novel and central processing still ruled the roost of enterprise IT, the Open Group was formed from the merger of the Open Software Foundation and X-Open. Yes, this October marks the 25th anniversary of remarkable achievements in the technology standards arena by the Open Group. Beginning with a focus as the publisher of the single UNIX specification technical standard and steward of the UNIX trademark, the organization has grown to more than 850 members in over 50 countries, and it leads the field in technology standard services, certifications, research, and training. Stay with us now as we explore how standards like UNIX and TOGAF evolved to transform business and society, impacting us all over the world as a digital adoption wave swept over human affairs for the past quarter century. Here to commemorate the Open Group's achievements and reminisce about the game-changing, earth-shattering, culture-evolving advances of standards-enabled information technology, please join me in welcoming our guests. We're here with Steve Nunn, Chief Executive Officer at the Open Group. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Dana. Glad to be here.
We're also here with David Lounsbury, Chief Digital Officer at the Open Group. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Dana. I'm happy to be here too.
And we're also here with Jim Hightower, Vice President, Business Development and Security at the Open Group. Welcome, Jim.
Hi, Dana. Good to be here.
Great to have you all. Steve, even after 25 years of clearly breathtaking changes across the IT landscape, why is the Open Group's original mission as salient as ever?
Well, I think, Dana, in a nutshell, it's because the world needs standards. The world needs open standards. We started, that was our heritage, open systems, open standards, and we added conformance to open standards importantly along the way. And it's never been more needed than it is now. I think when we started, there was a crying need for more choice among customers, more interoperability among different software applications, and the main proprietary vendors just weren't necessarily delivering that choice. So it's really because customers need standards. Now, they help suppliers too, and they help all of us in our day-to-day lives. But essentially, that's why we're still needed at 25 years on, and actually looking forward to bright next 25 years.
David, sometimes you have to pull people kicking and screaming into standards, but it's sort of like what your mom told you about eating spinach. It's for your own good, right? We couldn't get to the level and depth and breadth of technology without them.
That's right. And, Steve mentioned the need for standards, and the technology does drive the standards. At the time when we were founded, there were relatively few CPU manufacturers, and now there's just been an explosion in compute power, a radical fall in the cost of networking, and that's led to lots of new ways of doing business. And people are looking for guidance on how to do that, how to restructure, how to structure their organizations, what technology platforms they need to use. And that actually is, I think, fueling a bit of a swing back to the need for standards.
Jim Hightower, with a focus on security, 25 years ago, we couldn't have imagined the things that we're facing around security today. But without people pulling together, it seems like there wouldn't be an opportunity to fortress and buttress up our supply chains and other things. So how is security in particular really enabled by standards?
Well, I think it's interesting to look back at the past a little bit here, because in the world of security, you hear about really sort of two things being predominant themes. One is zero trust. And if you look back at some of the work the Jericho Forum was doing inside of the Open Group, 10, 12 years ago, those were really the origins of what we're calling zero trust in the security industry today. So, the whole notion of that perimeter security was failing and that we needed to move security controls closer to the data and to secure people's access within what were previously considered secure networks. Those are all things that the Jericho Forum kind of seeded the discussion with a number of years ago. And then the other big issue that's out there today is supply chain security, with some of the supply chain security attacks that have come about in the last 18 months. And here again, an initiative inside of the Open Group that was formed, I want to say maybe 10 years ago, the Open Trusted Technology Forum, that was brought to us by the U.S. government, was really focused around how do we address the security of the hardware and software, the components that go into those systems. that are being procured. And so there, I think we've had some groundbreaking work that was done inside of the Open Group on the topic of security that's still highly relevant today, even though the environment has changed tremendously, in the last 25 years.
Sure. And as Steve's mentioned, this is the long game. Sometimes it takes decades for the value of these efforts to become fully evident to all the players. One of the things that I'm old enough to remember is there used to be quite a few Unix standards or variants, and the process behind pulling them together for the benefit of everyone, both the users and ultimately the vendors as well, became kind of a cookie cutter for how you would go about standards in a more general sense. So, Steve, how did the evolution of Unix standards in particular, and then become a core singular one, portend the opportunity to do much more in much greater ways across all of IT?
Well, I think what we did essentially, Dana, was we converted what it meant to be a Unix system from being derived from a certain code base to being based on a standard. And the key here, on our topic today, the key here is it wasn't just one standard. It was a lot of mini standards, if you like, pulled together into something that was originally called the XPG or the Spec 1170, 1170 different specs that really changed what it meant to be a Unix system so that it was all about conformance with a standard and how the system operates in connection with the standard rather than derived from a particular code base. And I think when we look at this gathering a set of standards together, we can then see in our history since then, this idea of a standard of standards has been something that's we've evolved and developed and makes standards approachable and actually useful for solving business problems. And I think that's the absolute fundamental with the Open Group is all of our work on standards starts with trying to solve a business problem and having a set of standards that do that, make it more applicable, more approachable for implementation. And increasingly nowadays, we add things like even developing some code alongside it, which I'm sure one of my colleagues will speak to more later on. But that's really the essence of it, was transforming that first kind of Unix standard there, Spec 1170, this set of standards.
Yeah, and David, what a success Unix has become. Back when we thought this was going to be a way for workstations to interoperate better on a network, it became the foundation for Linux, for BSD, for the Mac OS, went from workstations to servers and then dominated servers. It seems that there's no better validation for the success and power of standards than what we've seen with Unix for the past 25 years.
Yeah, no question about it. You mentioned, of course, I come from the mini computer revolution was where I started in my career. And basically that whole industry got run out of business by Unix. And now we have it, as you said, on our laptops. I'm running it on my laptop right now. All of our smaller systems, embedded processors, all tend to run some sort of a Unix-like variant. I shouldn't say Unix-like, but a variant of things that look like the Unix standard. And it really is. If you've got to create something quickly and you want to create something that's robust and will run predictably, you pick something that follows that standard.
And how do you get people to rally? There's more to this than just technology. This is about culture. This is about cooperation. There's a real human and behavioral aspect to it. So I guess the best word would be governance. How has the Open Group been able to basically pull so many different threads together and repeat this? You've been doing this for, of course, TOGAF with enterprise architecture. You've been doing this with Open Agile, Archimate, FACE, other reference architectures like IT for IT. How is it that the ability to govern so many factions into a common goal, how do you do that?
There are a couple of dimensions to it, I think. And Steve's already mentioned one of them. He talked about the customers, and one of which was the fact that we recognize the value of neutrality, not only neutrality of technology, but also the other dimension of neutrality, which is the balance between the buy side and the supply side. And there are many, many things that are called standards activities that are really all tilted to one side or the other. And what we found is having that balanced viewpoint, balanced across the technologies, balanced across the demand, the supply and the demand, is really the essential key to having that stable buy-in to the result. Now, of course, that has to be built on a rock solid process that respects all of the parties all the way through in that. And that's where our formal governance comes in.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Dave's hit the nail on the head that the magic happens when the customers drive this and they have things that need to be achieved through standards. But I think the second point you made, Dave, too, is key. The process has been essentially stable, evolved slightly over the years, but it's a tried and tested process, consensus process, one company, one vote, where votes are needed, usually not. And it's allowed us to create trust. I think that's the word I'd want to bring out here. Trust in the process, trust in the equity of the process, and that all parties get to have their say. And that has essentially stood us in good stead. And we've been able to apply that process and that same approach, that same governance across now many different industries and business problems.
I suppose another key word here, Jim, is cooperation, because while the Open Group is a steward and is involved with the governance, there's a tremendous army of people who contribute the things that they learn and know and need from their jobs, from their day in and day out occupations that brings to this. So how important has it been to encourage that level of cooperation and have those so many people, as I've seen at many of your events? It's astonishing at how many people are involved with these standards.
It's critical to have the cooperation and the work, frankly, from the members. The Open Group brings the staff, can help initiate standards initiatives and run them, operate them per our process and our governance in a fair, open, transparent way. But the members bring the subject matter expertise in whatever area we're talking about. In the case of FACE, it's defense contractors and government folks, administering some of the programs, who bring the subject matter expertise that helps us produce business guides, procurement guides, the standards themselves, reference software, all those sorts of things. So it is key. We have a saying that joining a standards effort like the Open Group is sort of like joining a gym. You have to not just get the membership, but you have to show up and do the work.
Both of Steve and Jim mentioned confidence. And I actually think that confidence, that we can project that confidence in that process, both the formal governance and the ability to bring people together, is the real differentiator of why the Open Group has stood the test of time. We see many, many examples of groups that get together and say, well, why don't we just get together and solve this problem? And then what we'll find is that because they lack this stability, they can't project this stability, that they don't have the endurance. And fairly often we find organizations that started that way, and the government is a good example, where they come back to the Open Group and say, hey, can you help us make this the sustainable activity that will have the impact over time that we need?
Yeah, so I guess another key word here is journey, because you never get to the destination, which is actually a good thing. You have to be self-sustaining. It has to be ongoing, the peeling of the onion, the solving of one problem that perhaps creates others, and then again and again. So how is it that never-ending part of standards is a strength, Steve?
I think because the world, the various industries that we work with, they don't stand still. There's a new problem coming up every day, as you just alluded to, Dana, that needs solving. And when a group might get together to solve its initial problem through a standard, then they realize that there's actually much more there. I can think of some recent examples, such as our OSDU forum, which is in the oil and gas industry. And they really got together to focus on subsurface issues. Now they're realizing that actually a standards approach is something that can help them in many other areas in their business as well. So I think it's because the problems don't stand still and technology evolves, the world we operate in evolves, and disruptive events happen, and we need to adjust the standards, update the standards accordingly.
Well, I've wondered over the years, having a heritage with an operating system, but expanding well beyond that, if there's a logic, if there's a pattern to the standards that you've chosen to foster. So you've obviously been very successful with enterprise architecture and TOGAF. You've gone to modeling security, reference architectures for how IT organizations operate, security standards. What am I missing? What's the common denominator about why these particular standards? And is there an order to it? Is there a logic to it? And I'll throw it out to all of you.
I think the common denominator is something mentioned earlier, which is a business need, a business problem to be solved, whatever industry that might be in. And there's a story we can trace, and we have talked about over the years in the Open Group, where we can trace one such activity where a group of companies got together to solve a business problem and trace it right through to several other forums. So the example that we usually use is the Open Group FACE Consortium in the federal avionics space. That started 10 years ago now. They celebrated their 10th anniversary earlier this year. So that led directly to SOSA in the sensor architecture space, which strangely led to our Open Process Automation Forum, who saw the great work that was being done in the FACE Consortium in terms of let's create a modular approach, let's create an architected approach, not just have this situation where one aircraft, for example, is funded completely separately, no reuse of technology or parts. Everything is done from scratch with one prime contractor and subs. And we had some members, fortunately, who saw in the oil and in their case in the oil industry and the process automation industry, they saw we've got the same issue. We've got the same issue in our industry. We want some of this standard approach too. The Open Process Automation Forum is doing great work, really transforming the way that systems are procured there, as continues to happen in the avionics world. From there, we see the activity I referred to earlier in the OSDU Forum, and it's a very traceable connection between an industry that has a problem to solve, and the best way of doing it is to come together and work on it as an industry through tried and trusted processes, rather than trying to beat each other in the marketplace to the first magic solution.
Jim, it sounds like the need for a standard almost presents itself to you. Is that fair?
Well, it certainly was fair in the case of the example that Steve just used. That's an example that, as an outsider, you might look at that and say, now, what in the world do control systems users have in common with the military avionics industry? But I think the takeaway is, with each iteration of a new standards initiative, our staff have learned better how to support the formation and operation of the set of best practices around operating the standards initiative. But the members learn as well. So you had folks from ExxonMobil that had happened to go to a conference that some people from FACE were at, speaking about how they transformed their industry, and the light bulb went off. And they brought the idea back into the oil and gas industry. We, as the Open Group, helped them identify similar users in 6 other industries. So metals and mining, pulp and paper, utilities, water utilities, pharmaceuticals, all used the same set of control system equipment, all had similar problems. And so we were able to bring it into a multi-vertical industry kind of a standards initiative. And once you have that sort of support behind an initiative like this, the suppliers, who are all common to all of those industries, they sort of don't have a choice but to pay attention, get involved, and help drive the initiative themselves. So,
sure. And David, I think it's clear that just presenting a standard isn't necessarily the only factor for success, that you have to go about certifications, additional research, events and forums, and bringing people together, creating an atmosphere for collaboration, and then ongoing training. So you've not only broadened the scope of what the Open Group does in terms of the types of standards, but also a wider set of functions that augment and support standards.
That's right. Both Jim and Steve mentioned that process of discovery by the members or by potential members about the value of the standards. And that's a critical component, because the natural instinct is for people to go off and try to solve things on their own or get that magic bullet competitively that Steve mentioned. But part of the art of what we do, Jim's team in particular does, but everybody on the staff, is helping the members understand that only through collective action, only through a wide agreement, is there going to be a sufficient enough response to actually solve the business problem, but also, to the point Jim made about the vendors, provide enough of a center of gravity for the vendors to want to invest in building the systems that actually employ those standards. And so part of that discovery process, part of that showing is, so here's all the little pieces that build that continuing confidence that if we all work together, you will get a solution that solves the business problem. And part of that is knowing that there will be trained people who know how to use the standard effectively, that there'll be systems that actually conform to the standard and are not just paying lip service to it, that you can get together with your peers in the industry to find out about what's going on at the cutting edge of technology. And frankly, even the social networking component of that, just meeting the people face to face. So you have confidence that everybody's really in on it and really working towards that common objective. All of these things are maybe not formal governance, but that those critical supporting pieces that give people confidence in the outcome, confidence to invest in solutions and confidence to specify that when you purchase.
It seems like the big part of the secret sauce here is mutual assured success for as many of the people in the ecosystem on all sides of the equation as possible. It sounds simple, but it's really hard to do.
It is, Dana. And I think one of the things that we've tried to do, Jim mentioned earlier that the subject matter expertise comes from the members, and the kind of governance and managing the process is done by our staff at the Open Group. And that stood us in good stead. But it is hard to do. You need the champions. You need the people who are passionate about it in their own organizations, and they need to be allowed to work on the standards through our processes and bring their contacts in industry and all of those good things that really make the difference. But if I could mention one thing that was in your question as to how we've not just expanded the scope of standards, but the kind of services and add-ons to standards. For me, the single biggest differentiator and reason for the Open Group success so far is the fact that we have a very respected set of certification programs and a certification processes. Different processes for different standards, but the importance of certification is that it gives standards some teeth. It gives them some meaning. We're not just publishing standards for the sake of it and nobody uses them. They're actually there. As Dave said, there might be trained people out there. There might be certified products out there. Whatever the certification program is, it builds. It turns into a whole ecosystem around it. And that in turn gets the people more engaged and wanting to evolve and be part of that movement. So certification really is key because of the teeth it gives the standards.
All right. Well, the custom is when we have an anniversary to do toasts, and usually toasts are anecdotal and remembrances. So I want to ask each of you in turn, what were some events in hindsight that ended up being really formative and important, or just were very memorable? Steve, let's start with you. What comes to mind as illustrative of the highlights of the Open Group's first 25 years?
Well, we spoke earlier, Dana, about the UNIX systems and the UNIX certification program. I think for years we heard UNIX is going away. It's not relevant anymore. I think with the work we've done there has proved that that's not the case. I think a real highlight in terms of a breakthrough moment was when we got our TOGAF certification for people program in particular up and running, and that's spread now to a very large number of individuals around the world who are certified. And as I just mentioned, kind of out there in the ecosystem, promoting the value of the standard itself. And not to hog everything, but I think there's a very important aspect that you've alluded to, Dana, when you've been to our events. We've created a community over the years, and that community is harder to bring together right now in pandemic days, but certainly for the vast majority of our history and continuing, the fact that we can get people together, that people are familiar with each other, new people come in along the way, but the face-to-face element, the way that we bring people together to work on these standards is not unique, but I do think it is special. It is slightly different in a way. We try and have everyone in one venue. And somebody said to me recently, it was a great point about the effect of the pandemic on work in the standards world. And the point that was made was you really need that personal interaction in standards. Standards is about contributing IP sometimes. It's about compromise. It's about discussing what's really best for the relevant industry. And that's really hard to achieve in a truly virtual world, you kind of need the dinners, you need the beers, whatever it might be, the networking events to build up the trust with the individuals that you're going to work on from what are often competing companies in these situations. So I think the way that we have encouraged community and built up what we've often called the open group family over the years is a key factor for us. David,
you're next. What are some anecdotes that come to mind that are highlights of the first 25 years in your experience?
Well, I'm going to pick up on Steve's theme of that face-to-face meeting, because one that really stands out in my mind was the first face-to-face future airborne capability environment meeting, the first face-to-face meeting, which was done at a vendor building in the mall in Washington, D.C. And I'll be honest, there was a ton of skepticism, both from the government agencies and from some of the larger vendors, that this could ever possibly come together. And I think that because we got the people together, because we had a few enthusiastic champions who were not necessarily the people who started things out, but the people who saw that value of cooperative industry engagement, led it together. And 60 companies walked out of that room saying, yeah, this might actually work. And from then on, that was over 10 years ago now. And from then on, it's really gone to a place where it has changed the way avionics is produced, and now is inspired changes in other industry verticals as well. So that one really, really stands out in my mind of the open group approach. We sometimes called the open group way, really differentiates how we create standards from what had gone on in other standards activities that they were engaged in.
All right. Well, as the MC, I'm passing the microphone to you, Jim. What's your toast to the past?
So I would say a little bit higher level, the fact that the open group has grown as it has to where we've got over 850 members and memberships in place at this point from dozens of countries. I think the specific things that really resonate with me and have made an impact over the years is just engaging with all of those members from, many different countries and nationalities at events that we've held, over the last many years. And just getting to, I think we're over 110,000 TOGAF certified people at this point, which is a huge milestone and was definitely not an overnight success. TOGAF was tens of years in the making. So all of those really, to me, are indicative of kind of where we've come in 25 years.
Yeah, I'd like to react to that, Jim, if I could. It seems that the Tower of Babel isn't particularly high when it comes to technology. The technology is a common denominator that cuts across cultures and boundaries, and there really is a world stage for technology, or am I overstating things?
Well, I think that's true. I do think there's probably work that goes on inside of standards organizations like the Open Group that isn't necessarily seen that enables that, but there's a fair amount of activity translating work products of the Open Group in various forums into native languages, into Brazilian Portuguese, for instance, or Spanish or Chinese. Those are things that happen kind of at the ground level by volunteers, typically from those countries wanting to help enable adoption in their countries of, what they see as a really valuable standard. So
I want to take on that from a different dimension. That profusion of technology you mentioned has really driven fundamental change in the way people in the IT industry, at least, or technology using industries, are seeing how they run their businesses. And the Open Group is very much at the forefront of thinking about how that's going to happen. What does it mean to architect your business going forward when you've got all of these new management techniques, all of this new technology that's available at very low cost, causing these fundamental shifts in how you interact with your customers and your ecosystem? That's really on the forefront of the minds of many of the groups working inside the Open Group. And I actually think that we all know that there's a new management book a day these days. And I actually think there is a growing demand for some stability of guidance in this world on how to do these new, we sometimes call them digital ways of working, to look to standards bodies to come out with that guidance. And our members are working on it, I guess is the best way to put it.
I suppose the past is prologue. And, back when I got involved with enterprise IT in the late 80s, This was very fringe. There was a small group of people that you came across, but it's become more than mainstream. It's become dominant. We talk about digital transformation. We could probably just drop digital. It is transformation, period. So given the depth, breadth, and importance of IT and is now business, is now culture, is now society, where do we go from here? How do you take what success you've had for the past 2.5 decades and recreate that, but perhaps even on a grander stage? Let's start with you, Steve.
I think then there's an element of what Dave said here is organizations are having to transform, whether it's digital transformation, whatever kind of transformation. As you say, let's just talk about transformation. They're looking for a structure. They're looking for tools that will help go through this transformation, particularly as it's being driven so that it can't happen soon enough. And the pandemic has certainly been an accelerator for what we've seen here. But they're looking for a framework. And I think that standards provide that framework. And that doesn't mean that exactly the same approach to standards, exactly the same tools will be used forever in standards. But I think we're not going to reach a point where we need to fundamentally change the way that standards are built. We've talked so far in this discussion about the trust and tried and tested. And I think we need to evolve how things are done as we go forward to fit the speed with which transformation needs to occur and the demands that the individual organizations in their industries have. But it's definitely a very solid bedrock for evolving. And the transformation aspect of it is key because it standards, people see standards as helping them transform. They give them something to work with when all around is changing.
Jim, how about you? How is the past prologue? How do you take what success you've had with digital standards and perhaps expand the importance and use of the methodology?
What we've seen certainly in the last, say, 10 years or so is that the practices and business model and the approach to taking a big industry problem and solving it through the development of standards has been proven to work, and that companies that are in need of those standards efforts are comfortable looking at the open group and saying, you're an honest broker to be in the middle of this and really make something happen here. I would point to, we had a member from our OSDU forum who looked at what was happening there and saw a similar need inside of his company, happened to be one out of the energy industry, but saw a problem around how do we measure and manage our carbon footprint, and saw the approach that was used in OSDU and said, that's what we need over here in determining what our carbon footprint is. And what we found quickly in looking at that customer need was that that's a pretty universal need. It's certainly not just an energy industry issue. Cement companies and large auto manufacturers and others all have that same sort of a need and would be served by having a standards effort that produced not just standards, but in this case, a reference software platform that they could build from that helped them do what they needed to do in that area, measuring and managing their carbon footprint. So the approach, has evolved a bit. We're able to support now open source initiatives alongside of standards initiatives, but fundamentally the consensus standards process has not changed, and the way that we build these initiatives and rally industry support and then take them from looking at the customer business problem to producing standards and business guides and so forth that really address their issues hasn't changed.
So yeah, David, I think this last question is really about extensibility. You don't want to boil the ocean, but if you can apply lessons learned to even larger, more challenging and yet more impactful problems, that probably sounds worth doing. Is that part of your next 25 years?
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think there's a couple of dimensions to it. There's the scale in number of people who are engaged. And, we've given plenty of examples on this call of how we went from core standards like UNIX or IT for IT or the TOGAF standard for enterprise architecture and applied those same proven techniques to things like how you do avionics, which led to how to do process control systems, which led to how to do subsurface data. So that has led a tremendous expansion in the number of organizations and people who are engaged with the open group. The other dimension of scale is speed. And that is something where we know that we need to, sometimes the pace at which we need to keep our standards up to date has evolved. And you'll see if you look at the open group, how we've restructured, for example, our architecture portfolio to have more modular content. That's something we're going to be looking at applying across all our core standards, how we link them together, how we make them more cohesive, but also pick up how can we reduce the friction in keeping those standards up to date and at the pace where they're competitive with those sort of one-off, two people writing a book kind of guidance that characterizes our industry right now.
All right. Well, I'm afraid we're just about out of time, but for those who have been listening and might be interested in taking more of an active role themselves in open standards and approaches to standardization and the methodologies that seem to be really about problem solving at fundamental level, where can they go? What should they do? How do you get involved? Let's hear about what you've got coming in the next several months. There must be some celebrations, Steve.
Well, yes. Hopefully, we'll have some celebrations. We've got a great event next month, which is something that we've wanted to do for a while now, where we're doing over 2 days, effectively, over 24 hours. We're kind of doing a moving global event. So a few hours hosted in each of several locations around the world where we have offices and staff and significant membership. So we'll be looking at what we're doing, looking at what we're going to be doing, and a bit of a retrospective as well, because we deserve to. So that's coming up. I think also we've got an ever-growing number of active meetings that happen in our groups nowadays. Most of it because of the pandemic. Just about all of it has been virtual recently. But we're starting to see, as I mentioned earlier, the eagerness for people to try and get together face-to-face again, which I think will be a positive when, of course, it's safe to do so and people feel comfortable to do so. And we'll be looking at what we can, not just what we've achieved, but trying to look at how we go from where we are now to really making the next step. And there's a topic that's maybe not come out quite enough, Dana, if I think back, and my fault for not mentioning it. The work that we've done with some governments around the world is really starting to get noticed. And I'll give a good example of the government of India in particular, that recently published a standard called INDIA based on our TOGAF enterprise architecture standard, but it's being it's being used to transform government services, not just in the national government of India, but at various states. And then other countries are looking at that work being done. We've got work going on with the International Telecommunications Union in healthcare. We're really doing a lot of work with governments that are going to make a real difference to people's lives as citizens in countries that maybe need to catch up with some of the more developed countries. And they're using our standards and the work group that we've put together to get up to speed. So for me, that's a really exciting part of our future, is what difference can we actually make to people's day-to-day lives.
And of course, a lot of this information and the breadcrumb trails to follow, as it were, are all available starting at your website, www.opengroup.org. Any other resources that people should be aware of?
I would just chime in, Dana, that most of our publications, all of our standards are free to download from our library. So look for that on our website. Events, you can obviously find how to register for events on the website. And then at the forum level, there's good information about each forum and what they're working on. And there's always a contact form associated with each of the forum web pages where you can leave your details, and someone from my team will get in touch and tell you how to get involved.
All right. Well, very good. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. You've been listening to a sponsored Briefings Direct discussion on 25 years of remarkable achievements in the technology standards arena by the Open Group. And we've learned how standards like UNIX and TOGAF evolved to transform business and society, impacting us all over the world as a digital adoption wave swept across human affairs. So a big thank you to our panel. We've been here with Steve Nunn, Chief Executive Officer at the Open Group. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you very much, Dana. It's been a great discussion.
And we've been joined by David Lounsbury, Chief Digital Officer at the Open Group. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome, Dana.
And lastly, Jim Hytel has been with us. He's Vice President, Business Development and Security at the Open Group. Thank you, Jim.
And thank you, Dana.
And a big thank you as well to our audience for joining this Briefings Direct Commemoration of Technology Standards and Successes discussion. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host throughout the series of Briefings Direct discussion sponsored by the Open Group. Thanks again for listening. Please pass this along to your community and do come back next time.